Mike Slater here on the First TV, covering here the indictment of former President Donald Trump, the first president indicted on federal charges. 37 of them facing 400 years in prison. Can't wait for our next guest, but I want to play this clip here of some other legal experts saying that President Trump's in hot water.
It is an extremely damning indictment. It's damaging. This is not an indictment that you can dismiss.
If even half of it is true, then he's toast. I mean, it's a very detailed indictment, and it's very, very damning.
Damning is the key word we're always hearing. The wonderful Bill Jacobson, Cornell law professor, legal expert, and he's at the wonderful website Legal Insurrection. Mr. Jacobson, professor, how are you, sir?
Good. How are you?
I'm grateful you're here. So we've been talking about the Espionage Act charge, but there's 37 charges. So on your expert analysis, what are the charges that we need to know about?
Well, I'm very skeptical about the obstruction of justice charges, at least based on what's in the indictment. There's a lot that's not said. So, for example, they mentioned Donald Trump in the indictment, making comments like, well, what if we didn't cooperate? Well, what if, we did what Hillary's lawyers did? Are those really instructions to destroy documents? Were documents actually destroyed? I don't recall seeing anything in there that anything was actually destroyed. Moving of boxes. They don't put in the indictment that Donald Trump had knowledge that those boxes contained relevant documents. So maybe they'll prove their case, but I'm skeptical about that. They point to the attorney's affidavit that they say was false, but the attorney's affidavit saying that they had complied with the subpoena and produced all records actually says, based on what people have told me. If you're the Department of Justice and someone gives you an affidavit of compliance that's based on what other people told me, I would say, well, we want it from somebody who actually knows the facts. So that attorney affidavit was literally correct based on what people told her there had been compliance. But of course, those people hadn't told her the full story. So there's a lot there that may be provable, may lead a jury to say there's these little pieces, nods and winks that constitute obstruction. But I'm a little bit skeptical about that. On the other documents, the ones that really jump out and the ones that I think put Donald Trump the most at risk is they say that there were highly confidential, highly classified national defense information secrets that he waved around in front of some other people, gave them some opportunity to see it. We don't know how much, and specifically said, I could have declassified these, but I didn't. So that's real exposure to him. So I think he's got significant exposure here. I think we would need to know what more proof the government has on a lot of these charges, because what's just in the indictment isn't particularly persuasive to me on some of these obstruction charges.
I got some detailed questions on those, but a bigger picture question. What do we not legal scholars need to understand about what an indictment is and what's included or not included in an indictment as we read through it?
Sure. Well, an indictment is not required to tell the whole story. Okay, it's not supposed to lie, but as we know, the whole story may paint statements, may paint conduct in a very different light. So when Donald Trump says, well, what if we don't comply, to his lawyer, what was the lawyer's response? Was there any follow-up? The key thing that people need to understand is just because it's said doesn't mean, one, it's true, but it also doesn't mean that it gives the context. And that's what really jumped out at me about this indictment. It is very damning, as the clips you showed, but it's not the whole story. And I think we need to hear the whole story. And the indictment, of course, is really what the prosecutor gave to the grand jury, not the defense doesn't get a chance to provide information.
Yeah, the attack plans that you were talking about with Iran, we spent some time on that earlier. It's page 15 of the indictment if anyone wants to go ahead and follow along. I'm always very wary of ellipses, and it has a section of transcribed text from Donald Trump. It was a recorded interview. And then 3 big stars, like a big break in the conversation. And then like another, and you're like, oh, what, like you can't yada, 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 but I guess you can in an indictment, huh?
Yeah, you can in the indictment, but what was left out? What was the context? And there may be no context that salvages this for Donald Trump. And it may be that work was in those, ellipses were not really relevant. That's okay to put it that
Yeah.
way. But we don't know, and we've really got to wait to see what the full evidence is.
Okay, I want to go back to obstruction. So what is I think we have an idea of what an obstruction is, but legally, what constitutes obstruction?
Well, you have to take actions that prevent the government or interfere with the government's investigation, interfere with the government's investigation of potential crime. And so if boxes were in fact moved to hide them from a subpoena or to hide them from compliance with a subpoena, that's probably obstruction. But you would also have to show that the person who moved them did so at Donald Trump's instruction, and that Donald Trump knew that what was in those boxes was responsive to the subpoena. And that's what's not in the indictment, is did he know that this would actually obstruct the government's investigation? So that's
hard to prove, that sounds.
Well, I assume they have more evidence. I assume they have a lot of evidence that isn't presented in the indictment. But just as the indictment doesn't need to provide the other side of the story, it doesn't need to provide all of the government's evidence. So the government may have a lot more witnesses, a lot more evidence about the obstruction that's not in the indictment. That's why I'm saying, I'm not saying he's going to not be found guilty of obstruction. Just there really isn't enough in the indictment to me to say we've heard the whole story.
Very interesting. Okay. But it's hard in the court of public opinion to hold back, Professor, as you know. What needs to be proven intent? And how does one prove intent on a charge? That seems difficult.
Well, you can prove it from conduct, from you can't necessarily know what's in their head, but their conduct can give rise to an inference that they intended to do what they're doing.
Okay.
So if Donald Trump, knowing that these boxes had documents responsive to the subpoena, instructed somebody to move them and so that they wouldn't be searched, I think that's reasonable to infer an intent to obstruct compliance with the subpoena. You don't need to subjectively know what the person was thinking at the time. You just need to know that they intended to do their actions and they were aware of the consequences of those actions.
Okay, so you said the words reasonable to infer. Okay, that's enough for intent. I thought it may have to be a higher bar or something to do. So there's 37 charges. I don't know if you know the numbers of how many on each of these charges, but we've gone over like obstruction and stuff like that. How do we get to 37? And also let's take some time to talk about the Espionage Act, which I think has a lot of elements to it as well. So let's start with there. What's the Espionage Act?
Well, it's an old law from the early last century that meant to protect national defense information. It is not limited, or I don't even think the classification system existed at the time it was passed. So you can violate the Espionage Act with non-classified information. It's national defense information that, if revealed, would cause serious harm to the country. And so that's what that is. There are other sections of it, but the Espionage Act is not limited to what we commonly think of as espionage. You don't need to have been working for the Russians or the Chinese government or some hostile power to violate the Espionage Act. You simply have to have,
okay, yeah, good enough. So there's like no proof that he was like, hey, China, here's my battle plans. You rigged the election for me. I'll give you the like that would be next level, obviously. Okay, what is next? Oh, Professor, I could talk forever. I'm grateful for your time. What's next process here? We talked about how the Manhattan case, the next court case is in March after Super Tuesday, next March. What's the process for this, and what is the role of a jury, and how can one even find a jury for something like this?
Yeah, well, I just saw a flash on Twitter not even an hour ago that apparently the Attorney General in New York, Letitia James, has said that the Manhattan case probably will need to wait until the federal case is decided and over.
Oh, wow.
Now that's, I saw a news flash, so that needs to be confirmed, but that would be common, that you would not have two criminal cases going on at the same time and that the state would defer to the federal charges. So in all likelihood, we're not going to see the Manhattan case anytime soon go to trial. And the court, I don't know if it was set today, will issue a pretrial order setting a schedule for this. The government has said they want a speedy trial. Apparently, Trump does not necessarily want a speedy trial. There's motions he wants to make. He's going to contest some of these charges from a legal point of view. That is going to take some time. So in all likelihood, if there is a trial here, it's either going to be after the 2024 election or sometime next year, but it's not going to be next month. It's not going to be September. The government would probably be happy to do that, but it seems like Trump doesn't want that.
Patience, everyone. Professor Jacobson at Legal Insurrection, please make that a part of your daily reading. Professor, thank you for your measured insight. I'm grateful.
Great, thanks for having me on.
For too long, we've been led to believe that communism is a thing of the past. But the truth is, communism is alive. It's here, and it's infiltrating every aspect of American life. Introducing the Anti-Communist Manifesto by Jesse Kelly, the practical guide for patriots ready to defend our nation from its most dangerous enemy. Discover the shocking extent of communist infiltration in our education system, their alliance with American corporations, and the twisted truth behind environmentalism. This eye-opening book exposes the true face of communism and empowers you to fight back. Join the fight for freedom. Pre-order your copy of the Anti-Communist Manifesto today by going to jessekelleybook.com.